Alright, so I thought I'd share how I'm going to do this. What I want to do is I have my Facebook account which has some ads going, and this is a particular breakdown report that shows how much money I'm spending on all these different devices. So tablets, smartphones, different types of smartphones, and then there's the desktop. And so for each ad set, I'm spending so much money on each of those items. What it doesn't really tell me is how much I'm spending on mobile versus tablets versus desktop. Those three broad categories, which is exactly what Google Analytics will tell me, as you can see here. So what this tells me is exactly how much money I have made on these devices, but Google Analytics doesn't know how much I've spent. Okay, so this is telling me I've made about $1,300. So making primarily all of the money is made on mobile, and I'm wondering if I spent a lot of my ad spend on desktop or tablet whenever I should be throwing my money into mobile. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get out of it. I don't want to care about iPhone versus Android phone. I just want to know about mobile. And so what I'm going to do is create an export of this from Facebook. So I go to Reports and I go to Export the Table. Now I've already done that. As you can see here, it says successfully exported. So let's just minimize this and minimize this, and we'll compare those items. But I want to automate this, so I just want to export it and to be able to allow my Facebook Ads Analyzer tool that I'm creating here in Excel to just be able to allow me to open whatever file I want, and for it to automatically create the pivot tables, automatically massage the numbers, and categorize stuff. So what I've done, I have this table sheet over here where I have, I'm going to do a VLOOKUP table, a very simple table, where I have whatever Facebook calls it, like other or Android phone and iPhone and all this, and just have that be mobile would be the VLOOKUP for that. So I'm going to start by creating this table, and we'll be right back. Alright, so now I have a table, and I'm going to go ahead and just convert this. Not really convert, I'm just going to create a named range for this. So we'll call this device table and hit enter. So now I have a named range that I can refer to really easily in my VLOOKUP. Alright, so we'll be able to use that. We'll do a quick test. So let's say the word device other, and then I want to do a VLOOKUP equals VLOOKUP of this word here, and I want to do in the device table tab. There it is, and then column 2, comma 0 for an exact match, and sure enough, it looks up in the table in column 2 and says other. So that's going to be working just fine. The next step in our macro is we're going to have to open up that file from, so I want to create a file browser, and then I want to just automatically open up that table, the exported worksheet, and then we'll begin scouring over that and automatically adding the categorization to it. And I'll go ahead and show you what that looks like, because it's actually open right now. So here is all the data. I don't really care about the dates. I know about the dates. What I need here is the amount that I have spent, but more particularly I need to know the impression device, which is right here as well. So Android smartphone, Android tablet, etc. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and close out of this workbook so that we can create our macro. To kind of the first step is going to be to open that and then automatically create some data and then pivot that in a moment. So let's go ahead and hit Alt F11, and we're going to create a new macro. In fact, I'll just go ahead and create a new clean module. So we're going to create our first sub, and we're going to call this one device report. And that is what we're going to do. The first step is the file name is going to be equal to application.get open file name. There it is. I know it starts with application.get. I always forget what it is. So application.get open file name. I'm not going to use any filters or anything, because this is just me using it. If you're wanting to protect other people from using stupid file types, then you might want to enact a file filter. And I'm not going to allow multi-select, so I'm going to leave it the default, which is a single file. And I'm just going to hit enter. This thing right here will just open up a file picker dialog, and whatever the result is going to go into file name. It looks like file name auto capitalized, presumably because the word file name is a property of some kind of thing. So I don't want to use that. I want to use something unique. So we'll call this str file name, or str file. Might be easier to type over and over. So it's a string of text, and it's the file name. So str file. Here we are. let's test this out so far. So with F8 and F8, now I'm going to hit F8 again, and I'm going to get the file loader, and it sure enough, it took me to the devices report folder I have. So I'm going to open that, and when I hit OK, a lot of times when you have an open dialog, instead, even though you're stepping through, it's going to finish the macro. So I need to manually put a breakpoint to make sure everything's working okay. So I'm going to try that again, F8, F8, F8. Now after I pick the file, instead of running through and pausing, and running and finishing the macro, it's going to stop at my manual breakpoint, and then I can hover. So look, there's the file name. Perfect. That's exactly what I need. Then we want our macro to open that other file so that we can do stuff with it. And I'm not only going to open it, but I want to give it a nickname. So I'm going to go ahead and set up a object variable to represent the second workbook. So we're going to set workbook2 as a nickname for workbooks.open. And we want to open the file name that we already have, the str file. That's the file name as a string that we want to open. And I don't really care if we do it as read only or whatever. I don't think anything else really matters here. So there's no password. I'm just going to let it be. So we're going to workbooks.open, but at the same time, we're going to trap that into WB2. That way we can refer to WB2. I'm going to go ahead and stop our macro, because with an object variable like this, it might behoove us to dim or declare that. So dim WB2 as a workbook. That way it knows that if I type WB2 and hit a dot, it's going to give me the IntelliSense that belongs to a workbook type object. And that way we can have the .open, .save, .print, all those cool commands that we're going to need in a little bit. So we've got the file name, then we're going to do workbooks.open for that file name. We're going to trap it in WB2, and now we have the second workbook. Why do we not need the first workbook, the original, trapped into a WB1, for example? Well, because the original or the originating project is always referred to as this workbook in our case. So we don't really need to nickname it unless we just want to. So this time around, we're going to go ahead and step through a little bit more. We're going to select the file that we want and trap it into a string variable. Then it just did that command where set workbook2 to be equal to that one opening. And so now, whenever we refer to this workbook, it's the original one, and whenever we refer to WB2, it's this one that just opened in the background with all the cool analytics that we need. So the first step that we need, now that we have the other workbook open, is we're going to get the VLOOKUP results for the categorization. So let's figure out what the very last column is. Looks like it's Z, which is the 26th letter of the alphabet. In case we need to use the cells object, we could know that number pretty handily. Let's make Z1 equal to the word category or something. So let's do that in our macro. So not in any old workbook in any old sheet. We're going to do WB2.sheet1. And we're going to say range Z1 is going to be equal to category, or just cat. I don't really care. And then we need to create a loop that goes from row 2 to whatever the last row is. So we need to get the last row. If you don't have fast keys, it's a really handy program. So I have LR comma, and that actually will allow me to do the last row code really quickly. But if you don't have that, you can type it out really easily. So last row equals workbook2.sheets, and this happens to be called sheet 1. And we're going to say the cells object. Rows.count and column 1.end using ExcelUp.row. Wow, that's a whole lot of things to keep in mind. Okay, breaking it down very briefly, we're creating a variable that's going to grab the number of whatever row is the very bottom one by using that particular workbook, that particular sheet, and then we're going to use the, if you ever use the control up, down, left, or right arrows, they zoom around really quickly by finding the next non-contiguous cell. So whether they are looking for the next non-blank, if you have a bunch of blanks in a row, or if you have a whole bunch of things that have value in them, then control up or down or left or right will zoom very quickly to the next cell that is blank. So it quickly will find the bottom row by starting at the very bottom, in fact. So if I go over here, column 1, which is A, If I hit Control down, it goes to the very bottom. If I hit Control up, which is what we're doing programmatically from the bottom, it finds the cell A1 or A43. But we don't want A43. We just want 43. So we have to get the dot row from the cell A43, which is where we get the dot row. So the end Excel up is the Control up. This is the very, very, very bottom cell of the whole sheet. This is hitting Control up to zoom up to here. And then finally, we don't want A43 or its value. We simply want the row number, which is the number 43. So anyway, all that to say, we've got the last row now. With the last row, we can do some pretty cool stuff. We can loop from row 2 to 43 in this case, or whatever the last row happens to be whenever you are doing an export or an import. So we're going to go from 2 to that last row. So first of all, let's see. The sheet 1 range Z1 needs to be equal to cat. You can see that happening up here. If I hit F8, there it is. It's the word cat. Now we're going to get the categorization here. So we need to get the last row, and now we need to do a very simple loop. So for X is going to be equal to, let's do I. For I is going to be equal to 2 all the way to row, last row, which is 43 in this case. And then we'll say next I. So now we have a nice loop started, but in our loop, what we're going to do with each and every row on a column Z or 26, we're going to do a VLOOKUP for the current categorization, the current device type, and then we're going to look it up and get the word mobile, or the word tablet, or the word desktop from our little VLOOKUP table. So let's get that started here. I'm going to bring my breakpoint to a little bit further up. So we're starting this loop now. We have the last row of 43, so I is going to represent 2, and then 3, and then 4, all the way up to 43 in this case. So let's start our loop. So we're going to start with Z2, and we're going to need to look up another row in here. So let me see what column that is, rather. So the impression device is actually on column D, which is column number 4. And so that's what we're going to need to utilize for each of these rows. So we're going to say workbook2.sheets. And I could have abbreviated the sheet name, given that a nickname, and I still can, but I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste it a little bit for now. So sheet 1 on the current other workbook dot cells, because cells is useful in loops. Right now we're on row I, and we're always going to be on row I in our loop. So row I is going to represent 2, and then it's column Z, or I could have written column 26, the number, either way. As long as you put the letter Z in quotes so it knows that's the column letter. So that particular one is going to be equal to, and remember we're looking up from column 4 or column D. So we have to do an application.worksheet function.VLOOKUP. We're looking up what value? The value from column D. And since this is going to get a little large, we might want to go ahead and capture that value in a variable so we can, still see on the page. So let's grab that information. We'll call this one current device. Current device is going to be equal to, and let me just type the number 1 so I don't get an error for clicking away. I'm going to copy this and just tweak this, right? So we'll erase the number 1 and paste. Alright, so because this already covers what workbook we want, what sheet we want, even what row we want, row I, but we're going to use row D, or excuse me, column D or column 4. That's going to grab the current device. So if I hit F8, let's see. Oh yeah, VLOOKUP is not ready. So we can't actually continue on until we finish a proper VLOOKUP. So what are we looking up? Well, we're looking up the current device, comma, and then I gotta scooch this over because it's gonna get a little wordy. What table are we looking it up? Well, it's actually in a different workbook, so we have to use this workbook dot sheets, and then we need to see what sheet that's actually called on the other. It's called sheet 3. Sheet 3 is where I have all my lookup tables apparently. So sheet 3. That's where I'm looking it up from. Dot range, and the range in that particular sheet is called, we gave it a special name, I think it's device table. Yeah, that's the range name of that one. Comma. Alright, so that's the range from here. This is the workbook, this is the sheet, this is the range. That's okay, that's where we're getting it from. This is what we're looking up. this is where it's coming from, comma, and then it's going to be column 2, comma, 0 means an exact match, or false. If I did true that or 1, that would be an approximate match. So now I think we can click away from the VLOOKUP, and we should be okay. I'm not going to put any error trapping just yet unless we run into a lot of errors, and then we can do some of that. So if we're going to go from 2 to 43 in this case, the current device is going to come from column D on the first row that we have. All right, so we have the current device. I'm going to go ahead and put a breakpoint periodically. That way it'll pause and not get ahead of itself if it gets excited and starts going full speed through the loop. But anyway, so we have the current device. We have all these different things. We're going to try to look up Android smartphone from this workbook, that range that we talked about. And we're going to see if we can look it up from the other one, from the other workbook using the VLOOKUP. So I'm going to hit F8. All right, so it's not happy with that. All right, so that's pretty simple. It looks like the website says device like this, but all of them actually don't have the device and the space after that. So we'll pause and be right back. All right, so this is the format that should work just fine. So if we go back to here, the VLOOKUP should actually just be just fine. So if I hit F8, boom, on the other sheet, the WB2, on Z2, yeah, should say mobile here. And so let's continue down our loop here. Let's go, I is now going to be 3 because we just finished that one. So the current device is Android smartphone. That's once again going to say mobile. And if we take a peek over here, I see that it did. So let's just see F8, mobile, mobile, mobile. I'm waiting until it doesn't say Android smartphone. Android tablet. Now it says tablet over there. So this looks like it's going to be pretty consistent. So I think that's going to be fine. I'm going to put a breakpoint right here, the word stop, and I'm going to hit F5 after I take off this one. So that way it'll finish this little VLOOKUP loop for me. I'm going to hit F5, and it'll finish all these, as you can see over here. So all that's done, categorization, broad categorization. Now I'm going to record a macro to kind of set up a pivot table for me, and all I really want to know is the expenses by that new category that we did. So the amount that we spent by each category, and then I can simply compare it to what Google Analytics says that I have made, and then I'll know where my ad spend is actually best spent, or if I've been doing pretty good with it. So let's go ahead and pause, or really stop our current device report macro. It looks like that is working really well. So it opens automatically, puts the word cat in Z1, then it goes through a little automatic loop and categorizes them so that the pivot table will work out. But we need the macro code for creating a pivot table and doing some things. So what we're going to do now is we're going to manually do that while recording with the macro recorder. And to do that, in order to use the macro recorder, we really had to pause the current execution of the current macro, because otherwise we're still in break mode and it would not work. So I'm going to leave this alone. I don't care the name of this one. It's just a sample macro to get a new pivot table going here. So I'm going to click on A1 in the current workbook here. And I'm going to go to Insert, going to go to Pivot Table, and it should automatically get the current range. If it doesn't do that when we're doing the macro, then we can feed it the range name by basically using the last row and last column and creating a string of text that equals something like this. So it's not a big deal either way. And we'll have that happen on the new worksheet in the same workbook. But what I want is to take the impression device into the rows, and then what I want to do is take the categorization, so the cat as the rows, just those 3 or 4 categorizations, and then we're going to take the amount spent, wherever that's at. Here we go, amount spent, we'll sum that in the values, sum of amount spent. Great. So we want that to happen automatically whenever I run my macro. I don't want to have to manually do this because I want it automated. So let's go ahead and delete that sheet. Of course, I don't want to record the action of deleting it, so we'll edit that out. Let's go to developer, stop recording, and see how much of that the recorder actually picked up. Module 1, module. It'll be in a module on the other workbook that's open. So here we go. It's going to be a lot of extraneous stuff here. So this is where we added a new sheet, sheets.add. Then we put a new, created a new pivot cache and it's called pivot table 1. It don't really matter what the new one is called. That looks good. Selected that cell. More importantly, it took the current pivot table that it was just created, and it's doing some things here. I'm trying to see. I think a lot of this is just boilerplate, basic, boring, regular settings that are just kind of defaulted with a pivot table. But what is not necessarily intuitive or default or boilerplate is the fields that we did things with. So I accidentally put the impression device, and I meant to do categorization. So what it did is it put it by that field, and then I took it away, so it turned it back into hidden. And then instead, the most important thing I guess that we did is that we did the pivot field cat as a field with position number 1, and then we did a sum of amount spent. So we really could just reuse this stuff here. So don't worry about selecting sheet 2. I'm going to say that these lines are pretty important right here. So I'm going to copy that to my immediate window like a scrap window here. I don't really think that this is needed, but we're going to save it for later, and we'll just comment it out. I think so. The creation of a new sheet, and then inserting a pivot table into that sheet, and all this stuff right here we're going to keep as well. So we'll put that, we're going to go ahead and put that in our macro. Module 2 in the other workbook. Alright, so after we, where we left off here, we're going to go ahead and create the pivot table. Now alternatively, we could just do a sum if for 3 different categories, or 4 if you count the word other. But I want to go ahead and automatically create a pivot table on the imported workbook. That way it's just all done. It's just right there in front of you. So we're going to paste this, then we'll paste whatever we copied here. Paste that as well. Alright, it's not kind of funky looking, but we can fix the indentation later. Right now we need to make sure that the code works. So we're not going to want to use active workbook or just sheets.add. We're going to want to say which workbook exactly that we are doing this on. If we wanted to create this pivot table, I want to create it on the temporary workbook that is just being opened, so that we can just kind of take a peek. I don't want to import this into my master because it's just something I want to look at sometimes. I might just want to open up something and for it to immediately analyze, give me a pivot table, and when I close it, then that workbook is just dead. All the changes, all the new pivot table, I don't care. I don't need to see it anymore. I just need that data really quickly so I can just delete it immediately once I know. So I'm not going to actually have it do this on the master. I'm going to say on workbook number 2, add that sheet. And on workbook number 2, do this to the pivot caches and create a new pivot. So WB2, instead of an active workbook, we're going to make it explicitly the other workbook. So let's see, we're going to create a pivot cache database. The data is sheet1.c. I might want to put which workbook this is here as well, but notice this isn't a workbook object. This is a string of text. So you might actually have to take the file name and append it to right before here, and then put an exclamation mark to represent that, or a colon or something. So let's just see if this works. Certainly we would want to have the second workbook active if we're not going to edit this. We would want the other one to be at least active. Another consideration is the R1C1 notation. So row 43, column 26, or Z. So Z43, and row 1, column 1. So A1 through Z43 is what this means, and that is where it is grabbing its data. So obviously we would want to grab the data from whatever is currently the data set, and it might not go to 43, it might go to 100, it might go to 6, depending on your data set. So that kind of needs to be dynamic as well. Unfortunately, we'll have to do that really quick to make sure that this works no matter how much data that we have. Now in this particular report, we are just going to row Z, or column Z. If we have a lot more data, obviously we'd have to tweak that as well. I don't think the source data has to be in R1C1 notation though, so we could just gather A1 through whatever the last row and last column is, And so we might just say last cell address. We're going to create a variable called last cell address. And we're going to go ahead and assume that is going to say sheet 1 exclamation mark A1 through Z. And then all we need to do is append the last row variable that we had up here, which is going to be 43 in this case. It might be different, but that's all we really need. And then that is going to go here. So this last cell address, instead of this string of text here, we're going to put the word last cell address, which is a variable which contains sheet 1, A1 through Z43 or whatever it might be. And then it's putting the pivot table on sheet 2 in cell A3, which is pretty normal to put the pivot table in cell A3. So I don't really care about that at all. That's fine. Everything else should pretty well take care of itself because it's using strings as the actual names of the columns. So that's not going to change in our case. We don't need to make that dynamic. I think we should try it. So let's just go ahead and close out the other workbook. Don't need to save it. I do need to save my original in case something explodes during testing. So let's get rid of everything in the immediate window. I'm going to step through this really carefully and we're going to try this. Device report, okay, that's my raw data here. As you can see, there shouldn't be anything in column Z because I don't think we saved it. We didn't even create a column Z yet. So Alt F11. Let's go ahead and do that. So here's the cat. We created the column cat. The last row is 43 right now. And we're going to go ahead and hit F5 to create all those categorizations automatically. We did that step. That's awesome. Now the next one is to create a new sheet. So workbook2.sheets.add. I'll scooch this here so you can see the creation of a new sheet right there before our eyes in workbook 2. There it is. And then we're going to get the cell reference sheet 1. A1 through Z43 in this case, and there it is, and we're going to plant that in this pivot table creation thing here. So I'm going to hit F8 and it should create that in cell A3, which it sure did. And then this is actually extra. Who cares about selecting sheet 2? It kind of automatically selects sheet 2 whenever you do sheets.add anyways. We're going to leave this selection of cell A3 on that active sheet because that activates some of your pivot table information, at least whenever you're dealing with it normally. All this stuff, I don't really know what most of it does, so I'm going to leave it be. I'm going to let it go ahead and run through all its normal boilerplate stuff. Now this line is actually pretty important because this is the category. So we're going to need to create that as a row field, not a summary, not a column, but a row. And then we're going to have that be the very first or topmost position. So we can actually watch that occur as well if we want to enjoy that show. Let's go ahead and take the active field called cat, and we're going to take the orientation as a field, and the position is going to be the very first one. In case we had multiple, it would go to the top. So there's that with end with statement. That one's done. The next one is nope, we do not need to reselect sheet 2. So the recorder got that one a little weird, but that's okay. The next thing that we need to do with the same pivot table that we're dealing with is we need to add another data field. This time it is the pivot field called amount spent in US dollars as a sum of that one. So using ExcelSum. But that is already done by the recorder. So all I have to do is hit F8 and bam, that's really all we have to do. Cool, so there's our summary. I'm going to run it at speed now with no further delays. So I'm going to take all the breakpoints out and then I'll be pretty satisfied if this does it without really messing up at all. So I want to save my original workbook here and let's rerun it. So I'm going to kill this workbook. I don't want to save it. I want it to go fresh. So here we go. If we're wanting the device report, I'm just going to hit run. It's going to ask me where's the file you want to do. I'm going to hit open. It's going to do its thing. And now it is done. Boom. There's my report, which is actually pretty helpful. And if we're comparing that to the screenshot that I took of my Google Analytics, we can actually see here that I did actually spend quite a bit, $1,100 on mobile, so that it's actually pretty well commensurate with what I spent. I spent 45 on tablet, made 50. Okay. And then on desktop I spent 109 and I made 423. Well, that might be something to note. Let's go ahead and type these in really quick. All right, so my return on ad spend by device is actually pretty fun data here. So we see that on tablet I'm about at break-even point. I'm about just barely over break-even point on mobile ads. However, with my desktop spending, which was, I only spent $100 on desktop, I was actually earning 4 times what I was spending. So really, that's not what I thought at all. My presupposition was that I was going to be killing it on mobile and that I should, turn off all the other ads. It looks like I should be spending way more, concentrating way more energy on my desktop ad spend. Also want to invite you to our brand new Facebook group, the Excel Ninjas group, where we are rapidly growing. We have a big community of Excel ninjas like yourself, up-and-comings, and advanced people helping other people. So asking questions, we have group guides, like a 1-hour free training on getting started in Excel VBA. We have lots of live Q&A sessions with me as well as other people. You can download all the files for free. Also, we have a lot of free previews for up-and-coming courses and trainings that we're doing that can be available to you for free just for testing them out for us, such as the new XGrid course that's coming out really soon. We're constantly adding new resources and files, and we want your input so that we can know how to help you and how to help grow the Excel community. You can reach that by going to ExcelVbaIsFun.com/ninja or click the link in this description.